Here is the demo of active authentication. We will use test local as our authentication server using LDAP protocol. This contains the groups that we are going to use to integrate our FortiProxy with this Active Directory. The first thing that we need to do is to define this remote LDAP server. So click Create New under LDAP servers. Then let's give a name. I will name it test local. Then let's put the IP address 192.168.10.10 and the default server port is 389 for unencrypted traffic, and the common name identifier will be as it is CN. For distinguished name I will use DC equal test, comma DC equal local, and for the bind type I will use regular type. Here for the username I will put my username to be administrator at test local and the password to be my password that I'm using here for this domain, and then I will test the connectivity. Test the connectivity firstly. It's successful as you see. So I can communicate with this remote LDAP server, which is our Active Directory test local. Then I will click OK. It will be created as an object under LDAP servers. Then I need to create a user group. So under user group, I will create another group here to point to our LDAP server that we have created. So create new group. The name of the group will be domain users, and the type of this group will be a firewall type, because firewall type points to all servers that could be used under the local DB or any remote server that's not using single sign-on feature. In the next episode, we will talk about Fortinet single sign-on and see how this type is different than the active authentication that we are making. For now, we are talking about active authentication. Active authentication means the client needs to enter his username and password using an application. Our application here is our browser. So a login page will be appearing to the client to enter his username and password. For this reason, we need to choose the authentication type to be firewall. That will enable us from using our remote server that we have created. Under remote groups, click add, and the remote server is our test local that we have created. Then under groups, if the integration that you have made is successful, then you can see all the groups that you have created on this remote server, which is test local. In our case, we need to use our domain users and click OK. Then here we have remote groups created successfully. Then click OK. So this is our domain users group that was given from test local remote server. Then let's work with our policies. So under policy and objects, we have authentication rules. First of all, we need to create the authentication scheme that will be used inside authentication rule. So when you click on authentication rules, you find firstly the authentication scheme. Click create new and then authentication scheme. The name will be active authentication. The method, I will use it to be form based, and the user database, I will choose my test local that I have created to check against all the groups that are depending on this remote server. Click OK here to create your authentication scheme. And under authentication rules, you can start creating rules that will make use of these authentication schemes that you have created recently. So click create new and then authentication rules. The name will be active matching, for instance, and the protocol will be HTTP. I'm using HTTP for the web traffic, of course. And for the source interface, let's use port 2 because we have 2-arm deployment. Source address will be anything. I will enable authentication for any IP address, means anyone that's using our proxy as a proxy. Then authentication rule will be matched here to apply active matching. Then here for the destination address, I will also choose anything. And under active authentication method, I should use the scheme that I have created, which is active authentication. Click OK here. And finally, under policy, I need to call the group that will be matched against this policy and also to use the authentication rule that we have created. So authentication rule is the parent object that will match all authentication operations. Specifically, if you want to match authentication on a particular group, then you need to call this group inside the policy that will be applied to the web traffic. In our case, we're going to apply authentication on our explicit proxy. Policy existed here. So let's double click on this policy. Then under source, we have an option to choose, instead of address, a user. So I will choose user tab. And then I will check our group that we have created, which is domain users. So authentication rule will be matched against all trials from clients. Specifically, to do authentication, it will be using this security policy that calls the group, which is domain users. All right. Then here, click OK. Then you're got to go with testing using any client IP address. A login page will appear to the client. Then if he entered a username and password inside this group, which is domain users, then the client can access the destination server, ask it, and pass the authentication rule that we have made. Let's test this operation. Have here a client, which is client 8, which is a part of our domain, test local. I'm going to type the administrator username and password. Of course, it's not here with passive authentication, so it doesn't matter if you are using any client that's part of the domain or not, because this use case we're going to speak about in the next episode. So for now, if we try to test it from any existing client that's part of the domain or not part of the domain, it doesn't matter, because the client should have a web page containing username and password fields. To ask the client to enter these fields, then it will be checked against LDAP server group that we have called behind the scenes. But the client itself, if he entered the username and password using Windows login, it doesn't matter here because we are using the method which is active authentication, not passive authentication. So let's log in, for example, with the local account, which is user. I'm not going to log in with test local username, and we need to make sure that we are using our proxy to be 192.168.40.113. So I will search for network proxy to apply it on the whole system. All right, I think I'm using here Fiddler, so the proxy automatically points to our local IP address because we are using Fiddler for some operations. Alright, I'm going to use another machine. I will not use this machine here. Let's use, for example, our management PC. It's the same PC that we are opening the web GUI of FortiProxy, but let's try this time from our Mozilla Firefox. Let's open options and search for proxy. Alright, it's using 192.168.40.113. Okay, good. Let me open a new private window and try to ask for any existed web server on the internet. So for example, I will use google.com. As you see, we have authentication required. You need to enter a username and password to be able to access this destination server. So here it's an evidence that authentication is applied. But this is what we call active authentication. The client needs to enter his username and password in the browser before he accesses the requested URL. In the next episode, we are going to see another method called passive authentication. It's using FSSO or Fortinet single sign-on application that will be installed on Microsoft Active Directory server to fetch user logins information, and then it will provide this information to Fortinet FortiProxy. It knows exactly that this user is authenticated successfully with Active Directory, then the traffic is passed automatically. We are going to see this in the next episode. For now, we need to make sure that we can authenticate before we access www.google.com. So here, let's put any user that's part of our domain or the group that we have called inside the policy, which is domain users. By the way, any user that we are going to enter here that's part of the domain will be checked successfully because domain users refer to any user existed on the Active Directory database. When I entered the login information of our user administrator, you type just the administrator and the password of this account, then you can log into your web server as you see automatically. If I try to access any other website, like for example Twitter, which is now X, I have an error with the certificate because the CA certificate is not installed on my management PC. But I think I can skip this. Okay, because there are multiple redirections are happening here to x.com. So I think we can open x.com without any authentication happening because you are within the same session of the browser. So when you authenticate one time, you can access anything that you want. This is the method of active authentication. To open a web page, to put your username and password to be authenticated using FortiProxy, then you can go with your operation using our Fortinet FortiProxy. In the next episode, we are going to talk about passive authentication, which is the more common method to be used with FortiProxy, not to enforce the user to enter his credentials multiple times. We need just when the client enter his credentials using the login of Microsoft from the beginning, he enters his username and password, that's it. Fortinet FortiProxy must know that this client authenticated successfully, then he can access any existed web server on the internet according, of course, to the policy that's created on Fortinet FortiProxy, which we call single sign-on concept using Fortinet FortiProxy. So see you in the next lecture.